Hello everybody, my name is Garry Wills, and in this episode of my YouTube channel I want to give you a brief introduction into my new book, Throwing Thunderbolts, a Wargamer's Guide to the War of the First Coalition, 1792 to 1797. By way of introduction, although I've always been a wargamer of some sorts, my interest in the Napoleonic Wars dates back to this issue of Military Modelling magazine from June 1971, which contained an article by Charles Grant on Napoleonic columns changing to lines and that sort of thing. And together with Victor, comic for boys, had a strip on the how the 57th Foot got their nickname, the Diehards, at the Battle of Albuera. But reading these things got me totally hooked into the period, and I've been wargaming it ever since. During my working life, I trained as a chemist and was a food scientist for a big international company for 30 years. But once I retired, I decided to get involved in writing, and I self-published my first book, Wellington's First Battle, in 2011. That research also provided me the material for some articles on British battalion guns in Flanders, 1793-1795, which are published in the Smoothbore Ordnance Journal. The centenary of World War I brought to the fore some little magazine articles I'd done for the parish magazine into the 24 guys who were on the parish's war memorial, and that resulted in this booklet, The Men Behind the Memorial, which was published along with the centenary. My first book with Helion was Wellington at Bay, which is a study of the Battle of Villamuriel on the 25th of October 1812. I spent 8 years looking at just one day of action, and it's quite a detailed study. So that then led me on to a further study of McCune's division at Salamanca, which formed a chapter in this another Helion publication, Glorious Fleeting. And this gives a different perspective on how McCune's division behaved and fought at Salamanca, relying on a wider variety of sources than is normally the case. I then presented a paper at the centenary conference of the Society of Army Historical Research, and this paper was all about the mapping of the Battle of Linselles. If you look at the normal historical accounts in the histories of the Guards, they basically have the maps backwards, and so this paper hopes to put that right. And then finally, Throwing Thunderbolts brings together perhaps a decade's worth of research into different actions during the War of the First Coalition into my latest book. So, what is Throwing Thunderbolts? Well, essentially, it's what it says it is, a guide for wargamers who are either new to this period or new to wargaming overall. And hopefully it'll give them all the tools they need to embark on this exciting hobby. And when I sat down to write the proposal for Helion for this book, it became very clear that this is not only going to be a guide for wargamers, but it's also a very unique guide, because nothing to date has been published that's anything like it. And so hopefully it'll be of great use to everybody. And I hope that the book will also perform the role of a source book that the readers can keep going back to as they organise their future games for this exciting period. So in the rest of this presentation, what I plan to do is just to take you through the table of contents in the book so that you can see what to expect if you choose to buy it. So firstly, a few words of introduction. The thing that makes this particular period so exciting, in my view, is that it shows warfare in a state of transition. And I don't mean by this a whole new way of war introduced by the French on the unassuming Allies. It's much more nuanced than that. The fact of the matter is the French generals, the French soldiers, were really exploiting the change in military thought that had been taking place across Europe throughout the 18th century. One of my key references was Digby Smith's excellent data book of the Napoleonic Wars. And if you look through that, you'll come to about 280 potential scenarios that you could build war games around. And that's just on land. If you look at those 280 plus actions or battles, it's more widely distributed than you might think. The French won 142 of them, and the Allies won 141. So the action during the War of the First Coalition is perhaps more balanced than many people expect. It's not a case of French revolutionaries whipped up by their belief in the motherland, etc., overwhelming the boring fuddy-duddy armies of the ancient regime. It was very far from that. The other attraction of the war is that there are many different protagonists that you could choose to build your scenarios and armies around. And I cover most of these in the scenarios, so you've always got an opportunity to build a Piedmontese army and to see how the Spanish could work in this period and be slightly more successful than perhaps most of you are used to. One of the things that became quite important to me as I was writing and researching this book is something that Stuart Asquith said many years ago, that wargame is all things to all people and all wargamers, meaning that there is no right way of wargaming, and there's no wrong way of wargaming. You are free to do it as you please. And this is important when you read this book, because clearly my own preferences shine through in the examples and the scenarios that I've chosen. It doesn't mean to say I'm telling you how you should do it, but what I'm doing in my scenarios is giving you things to think about as you design your own games. And so I think this is important for all of us to remember as we're embarking on this great hobby, which is great because it's so diverse. I'm not renowned for being able to communicate excitement, but believe me, it is exciting stuff. One of the things that makes the period exciting is that the big men of the Napoleonic Wars are much more junior during the War of the First Coalition. So, for instance, you can't in the Napoleonic Wars have Napoleon leading 2 battalions as he did at this assault on Fort Mulgrave in 1793 at Toulon, or commanding a couple of artillery guns during the whiff of grape shot in Paris. Another element to it is that there are many firsts that are associated with the Napoleonic Wars actually are predated by what went on during the War of the First Coalition. So it is arguable that the glorious 1st of June preempted the Trafalgar in the way in which the British fleet pierced the French line, or attempted to, in order to stop them getting away. And you can see, you can play out on your own board table the charge across the bridge at Arcola, where both Augereau and Napoleon seized a flag and tried to lead their men across, and Napoleon's case ending up in the ditch. So continuing down the table of contents, I felt it was important to give the reader a brief history of the French Revolution. Um, Obviously, it's perhaps not possible to give a brief history of the French Revolution, but I wanted to give the reader a chance to understand the background of the wars as they stood in as brief a way as I could without losing total quality. So this few pages covers the transition from the formal meeting of the Estates General in 1789 that kicked the whole process off, through the violent storming of the Bastille, the attempted flight of the royal family to Varennes, ultimately resulting in the execution of the king. And this section ends approximately with the Battle of Valmy, which reputedly saved the revolution. So those brief 6 pages are then followed by 100 pages, a military chronology of the War of the First Coalition. In this, I've tried to give the reader the background to the military goings on, so they can use this as a source for designing their own scenarios and seeing events in their wider context. I'd be surprised if anybody reads the 100 pages from start to finish in 1 or 2 sittings, but try to think of it more as a source for seeing the war in proper context. So for each year of the war, what I've done is I've gone round each of the borders of France, the north, the Rhine border, the southeast and the southwest, giving a summary of the campaigns and battles and the nature of the armies at each point. And this shows a map that I use for each year to illustrate this point. Those of you who were on this, who was seeing this video, get the advantage of knowing that the blue cross sabres show the French victories and the red ones the Allied victories, and the red and blue ones are drawn. So you can see this this picture developed throughout this chapter of the book. There is also 2 other sections on the counter-revolution in the west of France, and also what was happening overseas. For me, I have a secondary interest in naval wargaming during the period, which is reflected in the scenarios. And so for each year, I also gave a brief overview of the naval goings on. Each of these lines on these charts, and this is the one from 1794, is another potential scenario for naval wargamers. And in this map, you can see the fleet actions that took place throughout the War of the First Coalition, and the glorious 1st of June, or part of it, is one of the scenarios in my book. So moving on down the table of contents, we come to the protagonists, and in this chapter I try to give an outline of how the armies, and this is mainly around the armies of the different states, were organised during our period. So in this section I cover Austria and the Holy Roman Empire, France of course, Great Britain, Naples, Piedmont, Prussia, Spain and the United Provinces, or the Netherlands as we now know them, plus the counter-revolution. And these sections will hopefully form a grounding to anybody trying to create a War Games army for those states. It's an important section because a lot of changes that took place after 1796 are assumed to have been to been relevant to the first coalition. So I tried to cover that off. And so an example of that is the Grenadiers of the Prussian army. There were more of them in the War of the First Coalition than there were subsequently. So moving on now, we come to wargaming the period. And in this chapter, I've tried to cover a basic introduction to wargaming, the what, where and how of wargaming, and I've used the model that tries to organise wargaming according to what the manoeuvre unit, the smallest manoeuvre unit in the game represents, whether it's a battalion, a brigade, or a division, or a company, indeed. And this chart gives me a chance to acknowledge at the top there one of Colin Ashton's photographs of his excellent 28mm collection, which are used throughout the book as illustrations. On the bottom left is my own armies are 15mm, and these are my Dutch Van Plattenberg Grenadiers that you can see there from the Linsell scenario. And obviously that section leads on to the next one, building the forces. And this is in two parts. And firstly, there's designing your army. What are you going to paint? How are you going to put it together? And my preference in my games is to use historical orders of battle. And you can see here an extract from the assault on Fort Mulgrave scenario in Toulon. And this gives you some idea of the sort of level of detail that the scenarios build out. And this section of the book describes the pros and cons of organising your armies in this way. There's also a painting guide with a difference. I'm not a professional painter. I've painted, I estimate, 6,000 15mm figures over the years. And what I decided to do was to explain how I paint 15mm figures. There are lots and lots of 28mm painting guides about, so I wanted to do something different that is based on my own experience. It probably won't be to everybody's cup of tea, and there's an element or two of heresy involved in it, but it's the way I do it, and I hope you enjoy my perspective. Next, we come on to what some of you will consider the meat and potatoes of the book, which is the scenarios. I have picked a range of scenarios, and you may find the selection odd, and so it probably merits a few words of introduction. I like to do a lot of research behind my scenarios, and I like to make sure the scenario itself is adding something to our knowledge of the particular battle. And so half the scenarios that I put in the book are ones I'd spent time researching over the last 10 years or more. So Boxtel, Linsell's, Toulon, all examples that I had ready to go. The other scenarios that I've chosen particular intention to try and make sure that the scenarios as a body cover the widest group of protagonists in the war. So hopefully everybody gets a shout, and you'll understand why I've chosen the battles I have. So the first scenario is actually two scenarios. For those that know, the Battle of Linselles was actually two events on the same day. In the morning, the Dutch attacked the French at Linselles, threw them out and installed their own garrison. In the afternoon, the French attacked the Dutch garrison, threw them out, and occupied the town, which was on a commanding hill. But they weren't thrown out before they were able to summon some help from the Duke of York, and he sent the British Guards in to retake the town, which is the second half of the scenario. And the photograph shows the game, the British attack, as I put it on at Partisan last year. So the second scenario, and these go chronologically through the war, is the Battle of Pirmasens, which was on the Rhine frontier between the French and the Prussians. And the Prussians were strongly outnumbered, 13,000 to 8,000, and the Prussians showed why they were the most feared army in Europe at the time. In fact, if you use Digby Smith's list of battles as your guide, the Prussians won more actions than they lost against the French during these campaigns. And the third scenario is the assault on Fort Mulgrave at Toulon. This is the action that Napoleon made his name at. This fortress guarded the harbour entrance to Toulon, and its capture resulted in the evacuation of Toulon within 24 hours. It's a particularly good one for those of you who like to see the British running away. But it's also nice because the garrison of the Caire Peninsula was comprised of several of the protagonists in the war. So there were Spanish, Neapolitan, Piedmontese troops, as well as the British troops and Royal Navy sailors garrisoning the peninsula. And scenario 4 is also two scenarios, and it's actually where I started. The Boxtel was Wellington's first battle, so you get to deploy Wellington on the battlefield as a brigade commander. There's two scenarios. One, because there are two potential battlefields: the Schindel battlefield, which was the subject of my very first book, Wellington's First Battle, and more recent research has suggested an alternative, the Lee Common battlefield, I've called it, and the scenario gives you both options so that you can try them both out. I remain unconvinced about the Lee Common battlefield, but it's important that you see it to make up your own mind. I wanted to put a sharp practice scenario in the list, and I chose the Whiff of Grape Shot, the event in Paris on the 5th of October 1795, when Napoleon repelled the mob, so-called, and saved the Republican government. It's another one of these interesting things. The mob, so-called, were actually the National Guard militias from the rebellious sections of Paris. So I don't know. I don't think it's particularly typical sharp practice scenario, but my test games have been interesting. So that's there. It's a vehicle for some good research on the background of the day, and gives you a chance again to play Napoleon in a very junior role. The sixth scenario is the Battle of Mondovi, which is the battle of which Napoleon knocked Sardinia Piedmont out of the war of the First Coalition in Italy. And you can see here on the left an example of the scenario maps that I've included throughout the book. Each scenario has one of these maps in full colour, showing you the geography and also the deployment zones. And it's an interesting scenario in its own right. It was a bit of a non-battle in the sense that the French attacked so fast and brushed aside the light troops, which formed the Piedmont front line at this point, that the French arrived at the Piedmont main line before they were ready, and they were soon running for the hills, as it were. So what I focus the scenario on is the battle between the light troops, and the Piedmontese light troops have the task of trying to delay the French from Serurier's division as they sweep across the mountain torrents through the woods towards Mondovi itself. So the big battle scenario in the group is the Battle of Castiglione, which you can see here in this photograph from Salute 50. I presented this game, and we fought it. We fought it a couple of times, both at Salute and at Partisan. And this uses Debellus Napoleonicis and or DBN, and each of the stands is effectively a brigade, and so it shows you wargaming at a different level to the other scenarios, which are probably my preference, of where each manoeuvre unit is a battalion. So the other three scenarios are naval scenarios. So scenario 8 looks at the glorious 1st of June, and obviously the idea of this book is to get beginners going. So I didn't cover the whole of the battle, but just the van of the two fleets, 7 and 9 ships respectively. And I've got a big Sails of Glory collection which I use using that rule set and Osprey's fighting sail, both of which can be used quite effectively at this scale. The next action is a frigate action off of Banderace, in which two British 74s were ended up in combat with half a dozen French frigates, and so this in relatively light winds. So this is quite an interesting battle in the sense that, you know, normally frigates won't go near big 74 ships of the line, but they did in this case. And it gives you an insight to the challenges involved as the frigates try to shoot at the ships of the line without being shot at, and so on. Both sides ended up badly damaged as a result. And the last scenario is pretty much a single ship action. The Les Droits de Marne was a French ship of the line coming back from an abortive attempt on Ireland in early of 1797, when it was encountered two British frigates, and the two frigates engaged the French ship in heavy seas, and this resulted in the French ship being wrecked, as you can see in the photograph, in the picture here, and this was with the loss of a large number of soldiers who were on that ship. So here you can see the full list of the scenarios in the book. It may be an odd choice, but I think overall it gives you a real feel for how to play war games for the War of the First Coalition, looking at them as a body, and there are lots of lessons to be learned from my experience over the last 10 years. So one of the things I've been doing over the last little while is creating YouTube videos of my games, and there are a number of videos now available, and I've just created a playlist called Throwing Thunderbolts, which brings together all of the videos that relate to the new book, and you can find them by searching me, and if you use my YouTube tag at Garry Wills Wargamer Author, you'll find me in amongst the other videos for the famous American author by the name of Garry Wills. Here you can see the list of videos in that playlist, and this includes both the games that I've so far recorded, and also the conference presentation I gave for around about Lincels, plus a presentation I gave on where Wellington's first battle took place. Continuing on down the table of contents, we come to a resources section of the book. And in this section, I try to survey the suppliers of figures and terrain that are available for the War of the First Coalition, and give you some clues as to where the ranges available fit and don't fit. So, for example, the chariot miniatures Austrians are very good as a range, but the Grenadiers actually are figures that are more suitable for the War of the Second Coalition, and so you need to go to Shoboki if you're a button counter to get that right. So that sort of information is involved in that chapter. I then give you a list of the online resources that I've used during my research, and obviously that will soon get out of date, but nonetheless it's a good starting point. I also give you a list of the bibliography that I've used in the drawing up the book, which forms a reading list. The bibliography is pretty comprehensive, in covering some 881 different titles. And the book finishes up with an appendix, a one-page appendix on uniform resources. The book is already 300 pages long, so I've not been able to give uniform guides for all of the protagonists in the book. But what I've been able to do is point you in the right direction. For example, Paul Demay's book on the German mercenaries has a really good uniform section, giving lots of colour plates, and that's well worth the money. So this now brings us on to some concluding remarks. Firstly, I hope that after reading the book, you will agree with me that the War of the First Coalition is a great period to wargame. There are really interesting facets of warfare during this period, whether it be the mass use of skirmishers by the French, the wider use of horse artillery, and the use of infantry columns for assault, as well as manoeuvre, that really mark this period out as being something special. It also presages a lot of the things that we argue the toss about during the Napoleonic period. They're all starting to come about, and you can see their development during this war, at the same time as recognizing that in themselves the history of those changes in warfare really goes back to earlier in the 18th century. Hopefully you'll also agree that Throwing Thunderbolts is a unique how-to guide when it comes to wargaming the War of the First Coalition, and I hope everyone enjoys it. And before closing, I'd like to thank Paul Demay and Gert and Jorge, who all have helped me with the research, and these people are experts in their own right, and I've relied heavily on them over the last few years, and their works should always be considered as essential parts of your reading list. And obviously I'd like to thank my wife, who helped organise my travel overseas and drove me around in cells, for example, and my 3 children, who all had different roles to play in helping me bring this project to completion. And finally, as every writer knows, once you've finished a book and sent it off to be printed, you're left at a bit of a loose end, and as part of responding to that, I decided I'd give a name to the guy on the front cover of Throwing Thunderbolts. And going back through my research, I decided that he was Grenadier Pierre Carroux, who has a very distinguished history of enlisting in 1794. He fought all the way through the War of the First Coalition. He was taken prisoner probably during the Hohenlinden campaign in 1800, wounded at Friedland, and never really got much above corporal. He was taken. What makes him appropriate is he was taken prisoner at Villamuriel in 1812, the subject of my first book, which is how I identified him. He was held in prisoner of war in Scotland, and you can find out all about him in the sources listed below. I'd like to close now by thanking you all for watching this video. This slide shows all of my publications, which are available at all reputable booksellers, and I hope if you are convinced to buy Throwing Thunderbolts, that you enjoy it. And if you've liked this video, please consider subscribing to my channel and pressing the like button. Thank you very much.